try to make a video. You want to be in a video? Thank you. Can I help you? You gonna let me do this? Okay, can you let me proceed here? I'm gonna get rocking. Waiting in line late at night, Avery was finally boarding the ferry from Prince Rupert. Most people were finding a comfy spot and going to sleep, but it was starting to sink in just how far away from home everything he knew. The night was dark, and he looked at plenty of navigation charts to know they were surrounded by rocky islands easily capable of sinking even a large ferry like this one if someone wasn't paying attention. But fairly soon they would enter Hecate Strait and have plenty of open water ahead of them. His next trip would have to be daytime sailing because he really wanted to see what they were passing. The sea had always held a fascination for him, with plenty of mysterious creatures lurking below its dark depths. And while his previous encounter with a big scary something had gotten his heart thumping, it didn't keep him from wanting to spend more time on it. Voices close by awakened him, and now there was a large island the boat was sailing by. Out the window on his side, the first hints of dawn were starting to appear on the horizon. Nights were definitely shorter this far north in the summer, which was just fine with Avery. The drive to Port Clements, which would follow this coastline they were sailing past, was getting to actually see it. They were sailing past, and getting to actually see it in the daylight was a welcome thing. After driving off the ferry and turning north with a whole line of other cars, he quickly turned into the parking lot for Balance Rock, one of the island's geographic anomalies. A large egg-shaped rock with just a small section attached to the shoreline rock at the bottom, begging the question how it got there in the first place and why it doesn't ever move. Hecate Strait had its reputation for being able to sink plenty of ships, so it's no stranger to rough conditions. The water today was dead calm, reflecting the warm rising sun. Plenty of dimples on the water's surface showed there was plenty of life moving around underneath the water. A very satisfying thing to see, since it was a lack of sea life that had driven Avery to make the decision to come so far north. Now, standing over and just quietly observing the peaceful surroundings, he realized this was one of the most peaceful moments he'd ever experienced in his life. He started thinking about his life up to this point, always making good, safe decisions, avoiding pitfalls other young people seemed to get trapped in fairly easily. He had a decent place to call home, the car he wanted, and time and money to do whatever he wanted to. Looking off that rocky shoreline overlooking the peaceful water, however, there was a lost, lonely feeling deep inside. Nobody was next to him to share it with. If he didn't show up back at home, it would be a long time before someone would think to ask what happened. A sobering thought, considering it was the first time it had really hit him, being a person who prided himself on the ability to survive with no one's help. Not that independence was necessarily a bad thing, because it was preferable to someone who never got out and lived life. Realizing that he was missing having someone to share it with was a new feeling for him. Sure, he dreamed about it occasionally, but being so far away had awakened a side of him he hadn't known existed. Ugh. He realized it would involve actually talking to girls. As hard as that seemed to him, it caused a queasy but excited feeling inside. He turned and headed back to his vehicle to finish the last little bit of his trip. Chapter 4. Mystery from the Deep. After a typical breakfast and plenty of attention given to Missy, Narvi was back on her porch overlooking the bay when this obvious tourist drove into town. BMW, Washington state license plates, probably either really old or a super spoiled rich brat. They parked next to the town pier, and an average height individual stepped out, obviously interested in the number of salmon rolling around. He didn't look very rich. Plain black shorts and a nondescript t-shirt for clothes. He pulled out just an average-looking fly rod from the back of the car and attached some gaudy pink fly after stringing the leader through the guides onto the fly rod. He then waded into the water until it was up to his waist and started casting. At least attempting to. Rookie, Nari thought as his cast landed in a tangled mess at his feet. He turned around and looked as if he'd heard someone say something, but couldn't tell where it came from. Nari immediately raised her coffee to take a drink, just in case he spotted her. She realized she'd spoke out loud and found it slightly embarrassing. The rolling salmon had moved away from him, and he had stopped trying to cast and tried to regroup the line. This time when he cast, the line flowed out in a perfect arc, and the fly landed silently on the water. She could see an advancing line of fish coming towards it, and watched as he slowly stripped the fly. 2 strips, and he quickly lifted the fly rod. Immediately, a silvery pink salmon came out of the water with a flashy pink fly stuck in the corner of his mouth. Maybe this guy wasn't such a rookie after all, she thought. The fish put up a decent fight, and she watched as he pulled the fish next to him and reached down and quickly slipped the hook out of the fish and let it swim off without touching it. For Avery, it was nice to finally catch a salmon. It had been a while, and his hands were still shaky after the adrenaline rush. He took a moment to look around. Fish were everywhere. He looked to his left at the houses lining the hillside just above the beach. Recognizing the one that he had rented for a month, it was at that point that he realized someone had been watching him. Trying to act like he hadn't noticed, he stretched out his casting arm as if he needed to loosen it, the reality being it was just a ploy to check out the interesting-looking girl watching from her porch. Her cup of coffee looked good, especially since he hadn't noticed anywhere to get coffee on his way in. She had a very pretty, exotic look to her, he thought. Shoulder-length brunette hair, dark, mysterious eyes. No makeup, at least not enough to notice. She definitely didn't need it to be pretty. He turned back around before it became noticeable that he was watching, although Nari had been doing her best to pretend that she was just observing the far side of the bay, so he would notice that she had been watching him rather closely. Most guys didn't catch her attention, and for whatever reason this one did, came as a bit of a surprise to her. He had a quiet maturity to him, and it was obvious he wasn't into being overly macho, which is a typical guy mistake. She wasn't fooled at all by his attempt to use stretching his arm to disguise that he'd noticed her, but thought it was kind of cute. She appreciated his respect for the fish, which was obvious by how he released the fish, including carrying enough to use a barbless hook, another checkmark on the good side of her list of expectations for any guy worthy of her time. As Avery had turned back around, there were even more fish coming ever closer, and he started casting immediately into another fish, and then another, and before long he gave up counting. Maybe after he was settled, he'd come back and catch one to keep. Nari was just taking the last sip of her coffee and beginning to contemplate a blueberry fritter. Maybe she would ask this new stranger to join her? The thought almost made her choke. She coughed a couple times. Ask a guy to join her, especially at Sally's? The whole town would probably show up to witness such an event, although Nari, worried about whether they could handle something that big. Change messed with everyone in this place. Forget the town, she thought. Something about this stranger had her interested, and just saying hi couldn't be that terrible. Out of the corner of his eye, Avery had noticed she'd finished her coffee and was beginning to make her way down the hill towards the pier. A strong shiver went through his inner core as she appeared to be looking in his direction. She walked confidently with excellent posture, a sure sign of someone who spent plenty of time on boats. Avery wanted to stop fishing and just watch her walk towards him, but a pink salmon chose that moment to take off with his fly, hooking itself. It was probably the first time Avery had ever complained about getting a bite from a salmon. Nari noticed this quick look of frustration as he turned his focus to fighting the fish. Before she could get any closer, however, something big in the water caught her attention, making a subtle wake as it headed towards the shore, and she could see salmon fleeing in every direction. Avery was still fighting the pink salmon, this one being the most energetic. He hadn't noticed the other salmon fleeing in all directions, or the wake that was heading straight for him, until the fish he was fighting suddenly sprang out of the water and managed to throw the hook, leaving Avery with a tangled mess of fly line as the now loosened hook flew backwards straight at him. His first reaction was to push the rod forward to toss the excess line away from him, and then he saw it. Something big was coming at him and closing the distance fast. He tried to back up and managed to tangle his feet in the line, but somehow maintained his balance. As he turned to his left to make a hurried attempt to reach the shore, something knocked him to his knees, and immediately he felt the barnacles in the rocks tearing up the skin on his knees, only to be interrupted by a searing sharp pain in his right arm. He kept struggling to reach the shore, afraid that whatever had grabbed him would drag him further out to deeper water. Rather strangely, it seemed instead to be pushing him towards the shore. With a painful tearing sensation, he ripped his arm free of the toothy, massive jaw. A sharp, intense pain let him know that it had left something behind in his arm. Reaching the shoreline, the tangled line finally tripped him up, and a sickening, cracking sound filled the air as he fell onto his fly rod, smashing it into at least 3 pieces, followed immediately by an even worse sound, the sound of his head crashing on a big rock. Nari gasped as she watched a horrific scene unfold and was in full ER nurse mode, running down the street and observing an uncomfortable amount of blood coming from his arm. Nari reached him first, and Chief Brody and his wife Becky was right behind him. Phil had barely made it out of the pub and was keeping a nervous eye on the water. A fleeing salmon had bolted out of the water, only to be immediately dragged in by what appeared to be a massive tentacle covered in suction cups, and it seemed to be scaring off the massive sea creature that had attacked the stranger. Phil Chevenhurl was not prepared for the scene that had just unfolded in front of the pub, despite an immense interest in monsters. The only reason he became a medical examiner instead of a Bigfoot researcher was the need for money. The unfolding horrific scene had him scared and caused dramatic hidden feelings to surface. Nari, however, was totally focused on the stranger, and she turned him onto his back, supporting his head, which was a bloody mess. Becky, with her straightforward English side coming out in full force, shouted at Phil, snapping him out of his shock, and told him to look in her car because she always had first aid supplies on hand. They had to get the bleeding under control. Thankfully, Brody had a knife and was able to cut and untangle the fly line. Phil yelled and tossed Becky's medical bag to her, which she responded to with a slur of unkind words about a scared medical examiner being too afraid of the water. Obviously, whatever had attacked the stranger was long gone. Even the massive numbers of salmon had disappeared. The sound of the ambulance siren filled the air as they wrapped the stranger's right arm and put a gauze bandage on his head, which caused him to stir. Nari was concerned about his skull being fractured, having seen how hard his head had hit the rock. Avery couldn't make out what was happening. Everything was blurry, and he thought some woman was leaning over him, but he didn't know why. His head was throbbing so much he barely noticed the pain in his elbow. A woman's voice softly told him not to worry and just lie still because help was on the way. All he could make out through the blur was a mysterious dark eyes, and then he was out again. The EMTs showed up and quickly got him on a stretcher and up to the ambulance. They gave Nari a towel to wipe off all the blood on her hands, and then asked if she knew anything about him. The BMW over there is his car. I saw him drive up in it, she said. Chief Brody found the keys in the pocket of the stranger's shorts and suggested they check it out. Nari, it's your day off. You've done what you can, so let everyone else do their job, he told her in his strong authority figure chief voice. Besides, once we find out who he is and where he's from, the hospital can check for any pertinent medical history and whether he has any family on the island. Nari agreed. She let out a long sigh, finally remembering to breathe again. She was relieved they were taking him away, knowing the hospital had what he needed. Besides, she was just as curious about who he was and why he was here. Becky was apologizing to Phil as she and the chief walked up to the stranger's car, but Phil still had a wild, scared look in his eyes and barely heard Becky. Nari had seen Avery put something in the center console compartment between the front seats after he had first gotten out and immediately found his wallet. So, Chief, apparently this belongs to Avery Quinn of Little Falls. Washington, she said after opening his wallet. And he's rented out your vacation home for a month according to this printout, Brody, which she handed to the chief. She also found a list of cities that started with the title Port. Bill had a line through them until she reached the bottom of the list and saw Port Clements. I see we're last on his list of places to visit. You think it's a bucket list? She asked. Maybe he's a serial killer and has left a trail of dead people, Phil said, apparently having recovered some from his shock. He was almost smiling at the suggestion. A fly-fishing serial killer, eh? What in the world would we think to call him, Phil? The artificial slayer? Nari asked sarcastically. She wasn't sure if Phil picked up on her fly-fishing reference, his fear of water ruling out any interest he might have with fishing. I'll say this, Phil. If we do have a fly-fishing serial killer, you'll need to get past your fear of water, because it'd be the logical place to dump bodies. far from anywhere people are likely to find them, Chief Brody said. He was never one to miss out on a chance at a good heckling of Phil. It was all in good fun since he actually appreciated having Phil around. His ideas kept life interesting. However, being the police chief, there were plenty of things about Phil that only he knew that definitely needed to be kept quiet if you wanted him to stick around. Besides, his interest in Bigfoot, crazy as it was, gave Phil an edge when it came to trying to find anything in the tangled Pacific Northwest woods that covered the island. Give him a good mystery and he was like a bloodhound on a rabbit's trail.